how the people are doing. So, these two phones, I think we can admit they have their issues. The Vivo especially. If you've seen any recent videos from my channel or anywhere else, you would have noticed that there are problems with stuff like AI upscaling. There's the portrait mode situation as well with the skin smoothing. But look, every phone has issues. I think we can all agree on that, at the very least. And this time around, Vivo has some very glaring problems, especially. However, on the other hand, we have the Huawei Pura 80 Ultra, a fantastic camera, without question. It is one of the most innovative cameras that we have had in the year of 2025. Simple as that. Very few phones can come close to just how cool the zoom feature is in general, with the way the prism just shifts to a whole new lens structure. It's crazy. And it's very interesting the way it works. But at the end of the day, the images you're going to see today, they're going to have so much personal preference baked into them that honestly, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, you're going to have to choose your own winners here in many cases. And personally speaking, I'm very torn between these two, because sometimes I like the Vivo, other times the Huawei produces insane and just stellar results. Other times it falls on its face. So yeah, that's the situation we're dealing with, which is why I think today's comparison is going to be particularly interesting. So let's jump in. Alright, so we'll be analyzing every single color profile on both of these phones as well, with an exception on the Huawei, very specifically. The bright color profile, the xmage bright, I think the best way to describe it would be to essentially say that it is an ungodly abomination of a color profile that gives you overexposed, just zero contrast, way too brightened up shots that it looks terrible. So instead, we'll be taking a look at the other two color profiles, the original and the vivid. Now the vivid is a bit of a misnomer. I think that's the best way to put it, and I'm sure you're already seeing on screen just how they differ. The original is the one that gives you, I guess, the most default look. It's not natural. That's not what Huawei goes for, plain and simple. If you really want natural colors, Huawei is just not the phone for you. On the other hand, we have vivid, which goes for higher saturation and really high contrast. The contrast is the one that's being jacked up all the way to high heaven, and well, I don't mind it in most cases. It's not the most natural, so it's not something that I am personally drawn to all that much. But of course, if you do prefer slightly more vibrant colors, then fantastic, that's exactly what you might be looking for. In a lot of these cases, I do really like how the Huawei turns out, especially when you have slightly flat lighting. It's tremendous. That's kind of the dilemma that I'm facing, because you see, on the whole, if I were to just pick one of these, I would pick the Vivo in most cases, because I know that I can reliably trust it to give me really nice and natural colors. And obviously, I'm only speaking about myself here. Now, you guys have to, as I mentioned, it's personal preference. You guys have to decide which it is that you want for yourself. Now, there are other technical differences between the two. We'll get to that in just a second, but I really want to address the fact that the colors are drastically different on both, and they are almost equally fantastic on both. So whichever one you prefer, there's really no wrong option here, at least in terms of colors and contrast. Is there more inconsistency on the Huawei because of just how high the contrast can be sometimes? Yes, that's kind of the sacrifice you make. It's like using textured mode on the Vivo right here. You will get some images that will have really crushed shadows, or maybe some blown out highlights, or maybe just worse dynamic range, because you have so much contrast, and that is true for the Huawei as well. Now there is another very interesting aspect here. So it was true in case of regular images, but also in high dynamic range situations, both phones take a tremendously different approach. The Huawei goes for high mid-tone contrast. Now what I mean by that is, if you look at any part of the image, it has really good clarity, really good contrast happening. Nothing feels faded. Now that is obviously not how things look in real life. If you want something that looks much more realistic, once again, Vivo is the one that goes for that. It does not give you a huge boost in clarity, even when using textured mode, which, by the way, high contrast modes on both of these are really good at handling high dynamic range situations. Now it's not perfectly consistent all the time. You're gonna get some situations where the textured mode on the Vivo is gonna crush shadows. But my assumption is that the overall natural look of the Vivo, despite having really good contrast in most cases, it is something that a lot of people might end up preferring. It is dependent on your preference. Once again, I'm only making assumptions here, but I do believe that the smartphone-like look, very punchy, very nice looking smartphone look that we have on the Huawei, it may not be something that everyone wants, at least not on a regular basis. It's not something that I would prefer on a regular basis either. Even though we have had some tremendous images that I prefer on the Huawei, it's still not consistent enough and it looks too much like a smartphone image for me to pick the Huawei for my personal use, that is. However, I am sure you're wondering, if Vivo provides something like the raw lighting feature, which is meant to be used when you don't want the smartphone processing, when you don't want something to look like a smartphone image, why am I not showing it here? Well, that's because I don't really have the samples in this case. However, I'll do you one better. I have the human subjects comparison coming out for this one. Just so you know, we do human subjects separately because otherwise it just gets way too long. In that, we do have some revelations with raw lighting and also the humanistic camera, so definitely stay tuned for that. Now, of course, as you may be noticing yourself, with the ultrawide camera, when you try to use the high contrast options on both phones, Vivo takes a very natural approach. The Huawei, on the other hand, I think it goes a little too far. The best way to put it is that the main camera strikes a very good balance on the Huawei when it comes to high contrast, but that's not really true with the ultrawide. So that's definitely unfortunate to see because high contrast on the ultrawide generally looks really nice, but in case of the Huawei, it's going too far. Not for my tastes. However, I have to admit, when it comes to backlit situations, of course, they are performing tremendously well, just like they did with the main camera, but with the high contrast profiles specifically, they're both doing tremendous and way better on the Huawei especially than I would have expected. I do think it just oversaturates and goes a little crazy with the colors, but the contrast balance itself, it kind of toes the line almost perfectly. Like you have high contrast, but it's not over the top enough that the highlights are totally blown out or the shadows are totally crushed. It's a much better balance than I would have expected, especially considering the results we got with regular lighting conditions. So the backlit stuff actually looks much better on the Huawei's ultrawide. But anywho, let us now move on to macro photography. The interesting thing here is this: they both have telephoto macro, which is perfect, it's fantastic, exactly what we want. But the Huawei's telephoto camera, as you may know already, it is possibly one of the best, highest quality telephoto cameras that we have on just about any smartphone. Even the Vivo's camera, I don't think it even comes close, especially when it comes to the sensor quality and size. And we'll see more examples of how it can be beneficial for the Huawei moving forward. But when it comes to macro, you can get just a pinch closer with the Huawei. However, the Vivo does have a little trick up its sleeve. Because you see, the Vivo is among the very few smartphones that can actually utilize a proper 2x sensor crop on the telephoto for macro photography. On the Huawei, of course, you don't really have the feature as such. Of course, you can crop into 7.4x and it'll work out if you have good enough lighting, but it's not really something that's meant to be used as such. On the Vivo, it very much is. Now, speaking of digital zoom, of course, we have the 2x sensor crop based off the main camera right here. Now, I'm not sure how much of this you can see on YouTube, but there is quite a lot of sharpening going on the Huawei, especially if you look at the road, the grass, it's just going buck wild, to say the least. There is some sharpening visible on the Vivo, especially the road as well, but it's not nearly as high as a Huawei. But of course, we're here for the details, so we're going to crop in all the way to 500%, and quite simply, it's less of a difference. It's less sharpening on the Huawei than I would have expected. There's actually a lot of smoothing going on. The Huawei is smoothing things out tremendously. I mean, grass detail is gone. If you look in the background, there's supposed to be some vents. Every pinch of detail in there is totally processed out. That's, well, interesting to say the least. I do think that even though the Vivo also has processing happening, like you can tell, there's sharpening, there's artifacts from the sharpening happening, but it's not nearly as bad as Huawei. So yeah, I gotta admit, that's not the greatest start in the world for the Huawei at least. But what about the 3.7x? Bear in mind, this is supposed to be one of the highest quality 3.7x cameras that we have on any smartphone, including the X300 Pro. But when we crop all the way into 500%, once again, there is some sharpening, a fair bit of sharpening happening on the Vivo. If you just look at the lines, you can see there's some weird aliasing or jagged edges happening, which is not nice. But then you look at the Huawei and there's just so much more of that. It's kind of crazy to think that we have such good hardware, but the processing is, well, I'm not sure if it's not taking advantage or if it's taking too much advantage of it and it's just ruining the image in the process. That's the best way to put it. It just does not look good. I don't want any zoom shot to look like this on either. It's at least not as bad on the Vivo. So comparatively, it is pulling ahead, but both of them can benefit from some restraint at the very least. But now, let us test out something that is unique on the Huawei. I'm talking about the prism shift. So essentially what happens is that the prism literally shifts to a different lens structure from 3.7x to 9.8x. So essentially what you're getting is a 10x hybrid optical. Hybrid because you also have a sensor crop involved in all this. That's probably because there's not enough space for this. So you do get a hybrid optical zoom, which is supposed to be, at least on theory, on paper, is supposed to be way better than anything we get on the X300 because it's entirely digital, the 10x on the X300 that is. However, when we crop into 500%, the detail preservation is just not there. Like you would expect 10x hybrid optical or any kind of optical advantage on the Huawei to produce significantly better results, but it's just not good enough. The Vivo, once again, it's got that AI upscaling, it's got that sharpening happening, but it's, it has more grain and a little bit more sharpening, while the Huawei has smoothing across the board. It's not exactly a pretty image on either, and it's not exactly realistic or good detail on either. So makes me wonder, what's the point of the 9.8x? And now, lastly, we have 30x, which again, it is supposed to benefit from having that optical or hybrid optical advantage on the Huawei. But well, after the previous shot, I have my doubts, to say the least. I think the best way to put it is that on one hand we have the Vivo, which is upscaling, it has some AI crap happening, which I guess it doesn't look the prettiest, but to be completely honest, who's gonna zoom into 500% on a 30x shot? So the fact that we're getting good detail preservation on the Vivo at 30x is honestly plenty good. But on the Huawei, which is supposed to give you a better result, it is giving you a deterministically worse result as opposed to the Vivo, which unacceptable, honestly. Like, what's the point of having a prism that shifts all the way to a different lens structure if it's not gonna give me better results than a single 3.7x telephoto on the Vivo? Anyways, when it comes to high resolution, things are gonna be a little bit more interesting. I think this is the place where we might see things turn around, to say the least. Not in terms of colors though, the colors look whacked out on the Huawei. That is not natural in the slides. I don't know where it's getting these weird warm greenish tones, but yeah, that's not working. The details, however, I have to admit, absolutely tremendous on both. Like, I can't even tell that I'm cropping in to 500% yet. That's very impressive. It wasn't even all that well lit, so I'm very impressed by just how nice it looks on both. Did not expect it to look good on both. Expected one of them to be better than the other, but that's honestly not really the case. Maybe a pinch more sharpening on the Huawei, but it's minor of a difference. And then of course the ultra-wide camera. Now, after the really nice results we saw with the main camera, I kind of expect something similar, especially considering that we have really good light in this particular case. Like, it's got a whole bunch of sunlight coming in, and it's basically ideal situation for using high-res ultra-wide. Turns out it's not worth it. The high-res ultra-wide is just not worth using because you're gonna get results that just look terrible. It's just two different sides of a spectrum here. We have total smoothing on the Vivo and just absolute over sharpening on the Huawei. So yeah, let's just say if you have a preference for the approaches that we're getting on either of these, pick your own poison. For me, I'll just pick actual poison as opposed to either of these. Now, the telephoto cameras. This is where things can finally get interesting. So we have the 50 megapixel mode, which is giving us a really nice look on both, except for the fact that the Vivo is really warm, way too warm. There was a little bit of warm light for sure. The Huawei is neutralizing it too much, but let's just say it wasn't nearly as warm as this. However, cropping all the way in, and I gotta admit, that 3.7x on both of these is turning out some tremendous detail. It looks really nice. You can see the canvas texture, you can see the paint, everything looks properly detailed, like realistically detailed, which is surprising considering some of the wacky ass results that we had in the previous ones. But then of course, 200 megapixels. All I can tell you is I'm not seeing enough of a difference between 50 and 200 either, which can be a good thing for the 50 megapixel mode, but I think it's just lackluster for the 200 megapixels. I expect something more. I expected at least some form of finer detail, maybe more natural sharpness, but 200 megapixels is just not doing it. So my advice, just stick to 50 megapixel mode. You're gonna get tremendous results either way. But now we're finally at the home stretch. This is night mode, and this is where you're gonna see some tremendous amount of difference between the two. I mean, you can already see the difference between the two. The processing of night mode on the Huawei, I think it goes a little too batshit crazy, because the Vivo across the board looks so much more natural. Now look, I'll admit, it can sometimes look a little cool with the way the saturation and contrast works on the Huawei, but most of the time it's going too far. I prefer at least somewhat of a natural look on the night mode. And no, the Vivo is not the best, not even close. There are phones out there that can do so much better. Like, you can get some really proper, nice, dark looking night skies. And you might be thinking, well, we have access to essential colors and texture mode on the Vivo. But the fact is, the difference between essential colors and textured mode is not nearly as much as you would hope. I, by default, use textured mode because you can get slightly better contrast sometimes, but most of the time it is negligible of a difference. There have been times when I couldn't even identify which one was essential colors and which one was textured mode. It's that close. This time around, unfortunately, it just doesn't work out. The reason I said this time around is because I have taken, let's say, some samples with the Vivo X200 Ultra, which has similar features. You can use textured mode on that one as well. Let's just say that it's a little bit different of a situation with the X200 Ultra. But look, for the sake of this comparison, I think it's very clear, for me at least, that the Vivo's night mode, even with slightly brightened up night skies and not as much contrast as I would personally like, it's still hundreds of times better than whatever Huawei is producing, because it is inconsistent. A lot of times it just gives you these weird, crazy colors, and especially warm lights turn out nuclear. But of course, there is one last trick that Vivo has up its sleeve. We get high resolution alongside night mode. So basically, you have night mode that can work with both high res and all the color profiles. The color profiles are a bit underutilized, I think, because of just lack of difference between them. But the high resolution, now this one can get interesting. I say that because when we crop into this particular shot, which was, by the way, fairly well lit, it's a night and day difference between the two. Like, you can obviously tell that the processing on the Huawei is doing it no favors whatsoever. Like, it is somehow over sharpened and smoothened too much at the same time, which is surprising to say the least, but that's just what we're getting. And the detail, the natural detail that we're getting, given that it's night mode, given that there's a lot of lights happening, a lot of shadows in there that needs to be exposed properly, this is a tremendous result on the Vivo. I had expected much worse, to say the least. Now, when it comes to ultrawide camera, this particular shot right here, this is probably one of the very few images that are semi-balanced on the Huawei. That's the best way to put it. It is stylized, it is going crazy with the colors, of course, but it's kind of towing the line, and it just doesn't do it consistently enough. That's the problem. On the Vivo, you're looking at essential colors, which, as you can tell, looks quite nice. Could it use darker night skies? Hell yeah, we need darker night skies. But overall, it looks very nice, very natural. But then we switch to textured mode, and yeah, there's basically no difference. The only reason I could tell this was textured mode is because I remembered taking zeiss natural colors first and then textured mode second. The color profiles, they need more action. That's the best way to put it. And now, once again, very similar situation here. The colors are going absolutely crazy on the Huawei. One looks stylized all the way to heaven and back. The Vivo, on the other hand, looks natural, like how you would expect things to look with your own bloody eyes. Look, I would pick the Vivo any day of the week, but I can see some arguments being made for the stylistic look of the Huawei, which is, not the worst thing in the world. Look, the fact is simple. We got some whacked out shots with the main camera, and it is performing better with the ultrawide, but the consistency problem is very real on the Huawei. But then, of course, if you remember, we also get high res with the ultrawide camera this time around, alongside the color profiles. Color profiles don't really mean much, as you probably saw, but the high res, we saw some really good stuff with the main camera, so I'm guessing something similar with the ultrawide. And well, I got a very genuine question for you. What in cherry red hell is this? Just, where's the detail preservation? I can bet you money that there has, in the history of mankind, there has never been anything that has been thrown out the window quite as hard as detail preservation on the Vivo's ultrawide high res, because bloody hell, that's terrible. It's in some ways even worse than the Huawei, which, that's already bad. As disappointing as that was, let's move on to 2x sensor crop at night. This is only for testing purposes because I would recommend to never use 2x sensor crop at night because you don't want a digital crop in, neither do you want to reduce the sensor size. The sensor crop is literally that, it reduces the sensor size. Anyways, cropping all the way in and it's just nothing particularly good to write home about. Over sharpened and weirdly processed on the Huawei and something very similar on the Vivo, just I guess a little bit less artifacting, a little bit more smoothing. Again, not something I would recommend using unless you absolutely have to. But now of course what I would recommend you use is the 3.7x on both of them because they are really good sensors and they work quite well at night. Let's first crop into 500% and establish a baseline. It's pretty good, kind of processed obviously on both phones, so you're not gonna get anything tremendous. If you are looking for really good detail preservation, there are certain things that you could try. So first and foremost, we have high resolution on the Vivo, so 50 megapixels, and it does give us a genuine boost in details. I do think that some of the artifacting goes down. There is still a lot of processing happening, but it does give you better detail, so it could be worth using. But we can try something even more ridiculous on both. So you can go for 200 megapixels on the Vivo, as you would expect, but then you can also try the hybrid optical zoom on the Huawei. I would say that given the crop is doing quite well on Vivo, considering that it's 200 megapixels, so you are kind of equalizing the detail preservation across the board. You could see it the other way around as well. And with that, we have reached the end of this comparison, which let's just say it's basically impossible to give you a straightforward analysis. So I'll tell you the approach. On the Huawei, we have certain pros, like sometimes, even though inconsistent, it can provide some really nice looking images. Other times it can be overprocessed. So that's what you gotta decide. Are you okay to live with the inconsistency, the sometimes overprocessed look, or not? That's basically the question you gotta answer. On the other hand, we have the Vivo, which has its own inherent issues, but I guess they are a little bit more subdued, the issues that is, because you only start to see it when you crop in tremendously. Let's say, you go to 30x and then you crop in further digitally, and that's when you start to see the AI processing, and that's not pretty to look at. Plain and simple, it is not something I would want in my images, but it is not something that actively affects the regular photos that I take that I know I'm not going to pinch in and zoom into for no reason, that is. So that is something to bear in mind. The problems on the Vivo are generally, behind the scenes. Well, that's not entirely the case on the whole. Night mode as well, it's a very similar issue, let's just call it that, because we get really good results on the Vivo by itself, but we also know that Vivo's predecessors can produce better, more darker night shots, more natural night shots. So that's kind of unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. Huawei, on the other hand, it has a very realistic problem. It's very inconsistent. Sometimes it can be stylish, but that stuff should be more of an option rather than just, the status quo. So yeah, a lot of things that you got to decide on. Like for instance, if you don't take night mode shots, then this doesn't matter to you. That's what I'm trying to get at. Your use case determines which one might be more preferable. So with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and well, there's going to be so much more to come. Cheers.